So this is why we think there is dark matter, but what do we think it could be? So what are some of the candidates? What could explain these observations? So sort of the main one that I'm going to be focusing on in this talk are called WIMPs, weakly interacting massive particles. So there's sort of the idea that maybe there's some unknown particle that's filling the universe that are weakly interacting. They only interact either by gravity and maybe by some unknown force or known force that's very weak, which is why we don't see it through electromagnetic spectra. It could be maybe primordial black holes, or maybe there's a problem with our theory of gravity, which would explain the observations. I've got sterile neutrinos listed here, which I guess could actually be one possible identity of what WIMPs could be. And there's others that I'm not going to go into. The reason that WIMPs is sort of a popular candidate is not necessarily that people think it could be the most probable, but because it's sort of the only one on this list that's really testable directly here on Earth. So if there is if WIMPs exist, then we should be able to potentially detect them in a detector here on Earth. There's several efforts to directly detect dark matter. I'm going to focus on this one called the LZ detector. It's a direct detection experiment for WIMPs. It's at the Sanford Underground Research Facility in South Dakota. And the reason I'm talking about this one is because I'm actually collaborating with some folks who get to work on this. So on the right-hand side here is a sort of a picture of the detector. How this works is there's a big chamber in the center of this detector that's filled with liquid xenon. And the idea here is that dark matter particles, if they're filling the universe, they're flying around everywhere, but most of the time they don't interact. So the idea is to get really dense, heavy nuclei in this big chamber, many nuclei, and just wait around for a dark matter particle to randomly bump into one of them. And then this would cause a disturbance that you could measure with all of the instruments in this detector. On the left here is a picture of what this chamber in the center looks like. This is about 9 feet tall, or 1.5 meters tall. To get you more psyched about this, in the next slide, I'm actually going to show a quick video from the Sanford Research Lab. It's about 2 minutes long, so we'll just go ahead and watch that.
Inside a Class 100 cleanroom on the surface of Sanford Underground Research Facility, researchers peeled back a protective layer of ultra-high vacuum aluminum foil, revealing the time projection chamber, the detector and innermost piece of the Lux-Zeppelin dark matter experiment. After 7 months and more than 30,000 hours of assembly, scientists unwrapped the completed detector, revealing a staggering 9-foot column of white reflective paneling. Inside, some tens of thousands of specially designed components, including hundreds of photomultiplier tubes and 4 intricately woven electric grids, combine to lay a complex trap for dark matter particles. Because mere traces of dust or radon could contaminate this ultra-sensitive detector, researchers donned full-body clean suits, complete with hairnets and face masks, before taking final measurements and running decisive diagnostic tests. This could be the last time this detector is seen for years, as it will soon be sealed inside a cryostat vessel and delivered to the 4850 level of Sanford Lab. There, it will be installed in the Davis Cavern and begin its search for dark matter.
Okay, so I guess if the Stranger Things music doesn't get you psyched for that, I don't know what will. So let's talk a little bit about how this detector is actually supposed to work. So the target, basically, what we've got this vat filled with liquid xenon. And the idea is that we're waiting around for a dark matter particle to bump into one of these xenon nuclei. And so sort of the basics of how this detector works is if a dark matter particle, a WIMP, came whizzing through and knocked into one of these xenon nuclei, then that would cause a disturbance in basically this electron lattice of xenon nuclei. It creates some phonons, and this is called a scintillation detector. Basically, the disturbance of the xenon nucleus will cause light to be emitted due to the chemical properties of the material. And so you have a particle come in and hits one of these heavy xenon nucleus. It emits some light, and you get a detection in these photomultiplier tubes at the top. And what you measure from this detector is essentially the amount of energy that was deposited in this collision. So you also get some things like when it happened and roughly where in the device that it happened. But the main measurement that you would get, the main thing that would tell you had a detection event is you would detect this energy that was deposited during this collision. And so that's something to sort of keep in mind going forward, is that what we get out of this measurement is the energy, which I'll call the recoil energy from this collision. Okay, so if we measured one of these events, and we haven't so far, what would we learn from that? And on the flip side of that, what do we learn if there is no detection event? So of course, if we detected one, that would sort of tell us that, okay, there could be these particles, maybe we have detected these WIMPs, and that would hopefully explain what dark matter is. And so in particular, a plot you can sort of make, even if you haven't detected something, you can still learn about maybe the non-existence of these particles. So here in this plot, I'm showing a dark matter nucleus cross-section. So this is essentially the probability that a dark matter particle will hit one of these nuclei. And then on the x-axis is the mass of the different masses that this WIMP could have, the dark matter particle. And using these different experiments, even if they don't see an event, that actually tells you something. Because if the dark matter particle interacted strongly with these xenon nuclei, then you would expect to see an event. You would expect to see something happen. So if you go long enough and you don't see anything, you can actually set a limit on the strongest that this interaction could be. So the Lux experiment, which preceded the LZ experiment that I just showed you, was able to set this limit. Basically, it excluded the possibility of any coupling between this dark matter particle and the nucleus, anything stronger than this orange-red line. So we basically know that there can't be dark matter particles, with these given masses that interacts more strongly than this with the xenon target. So we actually learned something even if we don't detect it. But still, either way, this is still really only talking about whether or not we've seen the particle or not. But what can we learn about the nature of the particle? Even if we see one, we see this particle knock into the xenon nucleus and we see that it was disturbed by a WIMP. We still don't know how it interacted. We don't know the nature of the interaction. So how can we describe this unknown interaction and how can we learn about it? This is sort of hypothesized to be maybe beyond the standard model of particle physics, something outside of our understanding. So how can we use these experiments not just to detect a particle and know whether or not it exists, but also learn about its interaction and how it behaves? So the way to go about this is really particle physics matter, so I'm not an expert on this. But what we can do is we can take the formalism that defines the standard model, and we can write down a really general interaction that sort of has a basket of properties that we think we would like to describe this interaction. So these are just some of the ones that go into this. It's going to be an effective field theory. It's non-relativistic because these dark matter particles, we don't think they're moving very fast. And we're going to be describing an elastic collision. The nucleus doesn't get excited into one of its excited states. And we're only going to be looking sort of at leading order in the momentum and energy. So the idea here is we want to have some general framework for describing this interaction and maybe hopefully learn something about what that interaction could look like, or at least set limits on what it isn't. So this work has been done. Some particle physicists and nuclear physicists have gone and they've written down this general expression for the interaction. And they've written up some codes that you can actually go download and run, and which will basically, they take in some description of the nucleus. So for us, that's going to be a wave function, which is the quantum description of the state of a nucleus. You sort of churn it into this description of the interaction in the quantum field theory framework. And what this spits out is a plot that looks something like this. You basically get the probability of seeing one of these interactions between the WIMP particle and the nucleus as a function of the recoil energy. And remember that the recoil energy is this thing that we're measuring in the detector. Dark matter particle comes in, it hits the nucleus, it disturbs the lattice of xenon, and we measure the energy from that recoil in the detector. So we can get basically an observable, the thing that we're measuring in the experiment, and we can also calculate it with some specification of this interaction. One thing that I don't think I mentioned is that, so this interaction sort of is extremely general in the sense that you can have different sort of classes of interactions between the objects, but we haven't specified the strengths of those couplings. So there's a whole bunch of undetermined parameters in this equation that you can tune and change because we don't know what the interaction is. We just know sort of generally what it could look like. Okay, so next slide. So how do we compute this interaction? So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about how these codes sort of work. So what we need to do is we need to take this Lagrangian equation, this particle physics equation, and we need to turn it into something that looks more like the standard quantum mechanics that we're used to in nuclear physics. So basically what we do is we take this quantum field theory and we turn it into something that looks like the expectation value of some operators. And what we get is something that looks like this. So in the middle, on the outside here, we still have these coefficients, these undetermined coupling strengths. We don't know what this interaction looks like, and it's basically specified by these unknown coefficients. And then we need to plug in basically a description of the nuclear target so that we know what this WIMP particle is interacting with. And in quantum mechanics, this is described by a wave function, basically a state vector in some basis. And since the nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons, you can actually break this down into smaller pieces that describe the protons and neutrons individually. And we have a special way of describing this entire nucleus as a product of states that describe protons and neutrons. And then finally, we need to have these operators. So these are sort of general operators that are all the basic building blocks of how matter interacts with other matter in the universe. And so we sort of have this framework for describing these arbitrary interactions that are unspecified until you plug in these coefficients that we don't know. So back to this question, what would we learn from a detection event or from no event? Well, essentially what we get now that we have this framework for calculating these arbitrary interactions is we can get constraints on those coupling coefficients. We have this general form, and by having measurements or no measurements, we can constrain what that interaction could look like and set limits on those coupling coefficients, those C's. Okay, so what's left to do? I already told you that people have written this code that computes these interactions so that we can use that to actually learn about what the interaction looks like if we see an event or if we never see an event. But there's still actually some questions left on both the nuclear physics side and on the particle physics side. So I'm going to sort of go over both of these. First, let's start with the nuclear physics, because that's what I study here at SDSU with Dr. Johnson. So on the nuclear physics side, there's still two questions that are related to this, but that are also more general to nuclear physics. So the first is, how can we provide these wave functions for these complex nuclei? It's actually a really hard problem in itself, trying to generate wave functions that describe nuclei. And once we do that, there's still the question of how accurate are the observables that we compute using these wave functions, the evaluation of those operators using these wave functions. People are starting to look into this in a general way about what is the uncertainty for these types of calculations, but it's still not that well explored, and there's a lot of work to do there. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the nuclear physics aspect of this, and in particular, this is sort of the work that I do with Dr. Johnson. How do we compute these large nuclear wave functions? So basically what we're doing to get these wave functions is we're solving something called the Manybody Schrodinger equation. So this is a differential equation that describes many-body physics. If you're not familiar with this, you can also think of this as a matrix eigenvalue problem. That's sort of the mathematical framework that we use to solve the differential equation of matrix eigenvalue problem. So to solve this, it's well known how to do this. You have to choose a basis to represent these abstract operators. And then you can compute the matrix elements of these operators. So you actually get an array of numbers that you can store in a computer. And then you finally get the full description of your system in terms of this matrix eigenvalue problem in terms of matrices and vectors. And then you just use your standard linear algebra techniques to try and solve this. But there's sort of two things that make this difficult. One of them I'm not going to address because it's sort of a bigger question. So the first question is, what is this H operator? Well, what is the operator here? So what it should be is it should describe the interactions, the differential equations that govern the interactions between all these nucleons. But it's sort of a problem, unlike in quantum chemistry, where you really know exactly what this interaction looks like. It's a 1/r² law. In nuclear physics, it's not so easy. It's not trivial to write down a form for this interaction. So that's sort of a problem by itself. But even if you do that, if you can write down some approximation even of what this interaction looks like, you still have to solve these equations. And the problem is that these matrix eigenvalue problems can be enormous. They can be several billion in dimension. So matrices a billion by a billion or several billion. So it's just a really intense computational problem to even solve this problem, even if you can define an interaction that behaves the way you want it to. Okay, so then just sort of plugging some of the things that I've done in this space. So for my master's thesis work, I implemented basically a truncation of the basis that's based on physics, a physics-based importance truncation scheme. And the idea here was to use our understanding of the system to reduce the model space size by throwing out basis states that are less important, or that we hope are less important. More recently, I've been doing some work that's sort of more numerical. On the numerical technique side, I implemented something called an on-the-fly Bloch-Landstrauss method. And this allows us to solve for the extremal eigenvalues, so just not all of the states, but some of the solutions that are important. And this method significantly reduced the computational resources. So I've got some different dimensions here. I got a little bit of speed up, so going about a third of the time in this example. But the real value of these methods that I've been implementing recently was to reduce the memory requirements. So these huge matrices can take up a lot of system memory and eventually just run out. So in this problem here, this would have taken 47 gigabytes of RAM in the previous version. And after the work I've done in the past year or so, it takes less than a gigabyte for the same problem. So that's a significant improvement. Okay, so that was a bit on the nuclear physics side, which is what I study. There's also some open problems in the particle physics and the detection of the dark matter particles. So the obvious one is we have to wait for one of these dark matter particles to be detected. There haven't been any confirmed detections of WIMPs yet. But there's also some questions that also relates back to the nuclear physics. So one of them is, how sensitive are the constraints to the underlying nuclear physics? So remember that even if we don't see an event, we can use that to constrain what the interaction could look like. But that relies on the inputs that we put into that equation. And the inputs in this case are the wave functions from these nuclear calculations. So something that really hasn't been studied in much detail is even if you have an event or don't have an event, the constraints that you get out of that depend a lot on the accuracy of these nuclear wave functions. And so we want to know, how sensitive are they? And then there's also questions about what nuclei make the best targets. You can calculate those particle physics equations to determine the probability for seeing an event for different nuclei and in different regimes. And of course, this will also depend on how accurate your nuclei calculations are. So that's sort of an open problem. Speaking more about this, I also got to do some sort of computational work with the particle physics calculations. So basically, I told you that there are these codes you can go and download to calculate these rates of detection as a function of the energy in the detector. Unfortunately, the ones that are available, while they work great, they can be a little bit slow, and this can really hinder doing sensitivity studies or exploring many different targets. So here's some examples. Remember that you have to specify these coupling coefficients to do a calculation. Here are some runtimes for these different operators, these different interactions. So 3,800 seconds for this smaller nucleus. For the xenon nucleus, which is what's actually in the detector, calculating one of these curves can take 20,000 seconds, which is, I think it's a pretty long time. So what I've done recently is take these codes and port them into a faster language, Fortran, and do some other numerical techniques to make them run faster. So here's some timing data for the same calculations. So I've dropped this one from 38 seconds to under about 2 seconds. And this difference is even more significant for the xenon nucleus. What would have taken 20,000 seconds to calculate one of these curves now, again, is also under 2 seconds. That's a significant improvement. That's not just fun to brag about, but this code will actually enable us to do more of those sensitivity studies that we're interested in, exploring how do variations in the nuclear parameters impact our ability to understand the detection rate. So it allows us to do more parameter space exploration. So here's sort of another figure just driving home the point. Here I'm looking at many different masses that these WIMPs could have versus the energy that you detect. And then the color tells you the event rate, how likely it is to see one of these events. So this figure with my fast code took roughly 30 minutes to generate. Using the public code that already exists that you can go download, it would have taken roughly 70 days to make the same figure. So that's a big improvement. And so with this, we can start to investigate some of those questions about sensitivity to the nuclear physics input. And we can compare different targets, different isotopes as targets in the detector more easily. Okay, so I sort of have this overview question again. This is my last slide. I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have. Here's some acknowledgements about, of course, my advisor and collaborators.
Thanks. That was really good. I do have one question on your second to last slide, the integral, not the figure, this one, the integral. Is that just a one-dimensional integral, the detection rate?
So what this integral is, so the first part is what I talked about earlier. It's essentially the probability for one of these interactions to take place.
Right. Okay.
This also depends on essentially how fast the WIMPs are moving, and we don't know exactly how fast a given WIMP is moving. So what we do is we integrate this probability over a velocity distribution for the WIMPs. Basically, what that is, we assume they're isotropically distributed throughout the galaxy, and then this velocity distribution is essentially how fast we're moving through the galaxy.
Okay. All right. And then I'm guessing you just did some simple integral technique like Simpson's rule to do that.
Oh, sure. Good question. Yeah. So in principle, it's a 3D integral, but you can reduce it to 1D if you assume, some symmetry. And yes, I used a Gaussian Legendre numerical integration.
Okay, so quadrature.
Yes, quadrature.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, one thing, significant difference between the public code that I'm comparing here is that it's in Mathematica, actually. So they do their integrals analytically. So it's this one.
I ask a question.
Of course.
You said that you're assuming that is
Isotropically distributed.
Isotropic. Is that a good assumption? I know that make it easier, but
yeah, so I think we don't really have any better assumption to make. So this is sort of an artist rendition. I think maybe, yeah, so essentially I don't know. This is sort of a question about the astrophysics of it. I think probably people who study cosmology and the evolution of the universe would maybe be able to answer this better.
Assume the isotropic. I mean, the cosmologists and astronomers, usually they just go for the simplest ones, so they just assume it's isotropic. There are more complicated distributions that have been studied, but usually for the purposes of what Oliver is doing, it's okay to say it's isotropic.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
very nice talk.
Thank you.
Is there any questions?
I mean, could you apply this for like the primordial black holes? I mean, primordial black holes are much bigger scale, but
so if it, so are you saying could you use this type of calculation to look at primordial black holes?
Yeah.
I think not, simply because a primordial black hole would essentially be just a gravitational object, right? Whereas the interactions that we're looking at are coupling to the quarks in the nucleus, essentially.
Did you have a question, Sasha?
Oh yeah, I was just curious about the Hamiltonian that I know you kind of skipped over that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know it's going to be different from the Hamiltonian we use in computational chemistry. So I was just curious about what kind of assumptions you guys make or shortcuts, whatnot.
Yeah, good question. So I know that in chemistry, I mean, there's different methods for solving it, but oftentimes you're actually working in wave functions that are actual spatial wave functions. In at least the work that I do here, we use configuration interaction framework. So the basis states are described by occupations of sort of an abstracted wave function, and we don't actually deal with spatial wave functions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
But many of the techniques are often overlapping in quantum chemistry and nuclear physics. The only difference is that the Hamiltonian is harder to write down.
Right, because your matrices are way bigger, right?
I think they could be. I mean, if you try to write down a configuration interaction problem for a molecule, that can be enormously larger than anything we do. But
the main difference is that we don't actually know what the potential is.
Okay, gotcha.
And it's also a local potential. It's got a different
Right.
behavior at small scales, whereas the electromagnetic force falls off in a nice way.
Nice.
Yeah, and also one should say, it's not that we know a lot about the nuclear force, but the problem is you're comparing apples and oranges, literally, or more like apples and you're like comparing like grapefruits and cherries. In chemistry, the electrons are very small; they're fundamental particles as far as we know. Whereas nucleons, the protons and neutrons, they're big, fat, non-local objects that can be excited. And so they fundamentally are actually very different from electrons. And so it's actually much harder to characterize the force between a proton and a neutron than and say two electrons.
Okay, wow, that's so fascinating.
Yeah, it's more akin, although we don't use this analogy, it's the nuclear force is more akin to things like you know, the force between neutral atoms, except it's much stronger. And so you have so it's really subtle and not so easy to deal with.
Thank you, everyone.
So let's suppose that if you don't mind me asking, so there are like other theories where the dark matter interacts more strongly with itself or with other regular matter. Would you still be able to do this for those kinds of proposed dark matter candidates, or do you need?
I'm not sure I quite understand. We haven't, but the model for the interaction is quite general.
It's quite generic.
It's generic. So basically it's a momentum dependent interaction, and it's sort of the leading order terms where you have couplings between like the spins of we assume that the WIMPs have spin 1/2, and that they can couple to the spin of the nucleus and to the velocity. So I can link you a paper if you want to learn more about the particle physics aspect of it. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert.
Because there are like candidates where the dark matter can interact more strongly than usually thought for WIMPs. So I don't know if that affects things for your calculations. I mean, they're not mainstream candidates, but they're like they do exist.
Yeah, but my understanding of those things is that they have to be very carefully crafted, because if WIMPs interacted strongly with matter, we probably would have seen them by now.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it has to be something where it's more strongly interacting, and yet in such a way that we haven't noticed yet.
Yeah, that's. But this sounds like it's fairly generic, so it should not be a problem.
Well, thank you all for your questions.
Yeah, I think that's about
Did
it.
you learn something?
If that's all for this week, I believe we are taking a break next week, and so we'll be back on the 16th. Hopefully everybody can make it again. Thanks for attending. Thank you, Oliver. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
Thanks.